Okay, more people coming. Okay, so it's really a pleasure for me to introduce Natalie Gold. Natalie is a researcher at the Center for Philosophy of Natural and Social Science at the LSE, at the London School of Economics and Political Science, but she also works outside academia as a deputy head of behavioral insight and lead behavioral scientist at Public Health England. Correct me if I'm wrong. So she works with an interdisciplinary team of behavioral scientists that advise on policy and practice and apply the evidence of behavioral science to public health, with a lot of good aims, including reducing health inequalities, among others. And before that, she has had many faculty appointments in several places, including the University of Edinburgh, the King's College, and the University of Oxford. And I've been lucky enough to attend 3 or 4, I think, of Natalie's talks in the past. And I know she does truly exciting work in the philosophy of social science, but also in moral psychology, experimental philosophy, behavioral science. And more specifically, she has worked really a lot on topics like cooperation and coordination, nudge, of course, but also self-control, behavioral science in public health, of course, collective intentionality. So it's really a pleasure to have her today. And her talk will be she will talk for about 40, 50 or 60 minutes, more or less. And then we will have plenty of time for questions. But if you have any clarificatory question or remark, just put it in the chat. Unfortunately, you'll be unable to unmute yourself because we had some cyber attacks in the previous meeting, so everyone is on mute. But if you want to speak, I'll be able to unmute you, and same during the Q&A. And we will have plenty of times for questions after that. We have time until 7. Okay, thank you. And Natalie, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much. So I should say, Sophia, as she mentioned, I have at least 2 different hats. I'm definitely here with my London School of Economics hat on. I'm not speaking for any government organisation, but I suppose this in some ways, actually, I think it might be my first foray into thinking really about nudge. And I suppose I am interested in why it's acceptable to do that, because in part of my life, I do spend a bit of time doing that. But if you've seen a lot of my talks before, some of it is going to be rather familiar, because I basically end up thinking that some things that I was working on that didn't seem particularly connected to nudge actually potentially are. So I'll jump straight in. Oh, except that I can't make my slides. Oh, there we go. Make the slides go. Okay. Can you, if I see stuff on my screen, like people entering the waiting room, can I just check? Do you all see that as well? Did you see
I can take care of that, so don't worry.
Okay,
I'll let them in.
Okay. It's just that it is over the top of the screen. Like, I don't know if you can see, but anyway. If there's a problem and you can't see over the screen, then let me know.
No, I think it depends on your personal setting, on your personal device, so it doesn't matter.
That sounds like it's technologically beyond me. Okay. Okay, so presumably probably everyone in the seminar is pretty familiar with the concept of a nudge. So this is just a couple of examples of sort of classic nudges that come out of right back to the Thaler and Starnstein book. So we've got the arrangement of food in a cafeteria. So the idea that if you place the healthy foods at eye level, or if you put them earlier in line without removing the unhealthy choices from the menu, then that can influence people to make healthier choices. And you've got the Save More Tomorrow example, that if you automatically enroll people in pension plans, but give them the ability to opt out, then that can increase the savings rate. So what interests me about these examples is they've all got a temporal aspect. They all look to me like problems of intertemporal decision-making, right? So both of those nudges are aiming to prevent people from taking an action that they think won't serve their long-term interests. Now, of course, that doesn't cover all nudges. So some nudges, and those intertemporal nudges are what I'm going to concentrate on. So there are some things that are out of scope in this talk. So there are other nudges, like another famous one is the idea of the people being defaulted into being organ donors. And that doesn't look like it's an intertemporal sort of something that's good for the person. That looks like it's something that's socially good. So nudges like that, or nudges like pro-environmental behavior, those aren't things that I'm going to consider in this talk. But I also think well, if you're thinking about why nudge, then they're not the big problem, because we all know that, you know, the state, one of the reasons the state exists is to solve collective action problems. So if you're nudging people for the common good, then that already seems to be a justification. And the nudges that are a bit trickier are the ones that are basically the paternalist nudges. So Thaler and Sunstein define a nudge as any aspect of the choice architecture that alters people's behavior in a predictable way without forbidding any options or significantly changing their incentives. So let's think about that. So think about what is a nudge. So it manipulates the environment, it changes behavior in a predictable manner, but it doesn't forbid options or significantly change economic incentives. Something else we could add to that, that's maybe not part of the definition, but people often talk about the mechanism by which a nudge occurs. And so here Thaler and Sunstein say, a nudge is any factor that significantly alters the behavior of humans, even though it would be ignored by econs. Well, what does that mean? So one thought is that a nudge is anything that deviates from the classical economic model of rationality. So it takes advantage of heuristics and biases. Another thought that people sometimes have is that a nudge operates through system one automatic processes. And the stuff about mechanism will come up again a bit later. But the kind of important thing for Thaler and Sunstein really is this without forbidding options or significantly changing economic incentives, because that gets them to libertarian paternalism. So a nudge is paternalistic because you're influencing people's behavior in order to make their lives longer, healthier, and better. But it's also libertarian because people should be free to do what they like and opt out of undesirable arrangements if they want to do so. And I'm not going to spend lots of time directly criticizing that, because other people have, although there'll be some critical fallout later. Anyway, so what I want to think about though is, what about the individual decision maker, right? So if you look at these justifications, it's all about what the policymaker can do to the individual. But you might think, well, actually, how's an individual decision maker who's thinking about their intertemporal choices justify them? And that's going to deviate entirely from these ideas of libertarian paternalism. So it's kind of interesting that you have a justification of what the policymaker can do that looks like it's completely diverges from a justification that an individual trying to do those actions for themselves would take. So what I want to do in this talk is really go back to individual intertemporal choice. And what I'm going to do is basically convince you that there's a puzzle, I hope. And this is where some of it might look familiar to some of you. So in decision theory, there's a problem of how an individual can be justified in resisting temptation. So I'm going to convince you that there really is a problem, hopefully. And then I'm going to present a solution to that problem. So why an individual should resist temptation. And then from that, I'm going to think about, well, given how an individual should do it, why an individual should do it, what does that tell us about why policymakers should do it? And the reason it's going to look familiar is that the kind of chunk of decision theory that sits in the middle. I'm going to skim it hopefully relatively quickly, but not too quickly, but it's all either published or forthcoming. So if people want to see more on it, they can. And the other thing that you get is a little bit of bonus content in that another thing that's going to fall out of this is another way that we can think about the mechanism of nudge. So people often go, oh, automatic processes or system two. And I'll give you another, I don't know if it counts as system one or system two, but another view about how these things might be working. Okay, so let's start with individual intertemporal choice and the question of how to deal with temptation. So sometimes we make a decision about an action that we're going to take at a later date, and maybe we even form an intention about what we're going to do as part of a larger plan. But our judgment about what it would be best to do undergoes a temporary shift at the time of action. So for example, you might have decided in advance that you're going to forego something nice, like deciding you're not going to have dessert, or you might decide that you want to do something in the future that you know is going to be unpleasant, like you want to go for a run. It's going to involve getting up very early in the morning at the crack of dawn. However, those sort of actions, they may not seem like such a good idea at the time, right? When it comes to the point of refusing dessert or the point of getting up, it may not look so tempting. But afterwards, then preferences revert and you go back to thinking, well, I shouldn't have had dessert, or I should have got up for my run. And so if you didn't take the action, then you regret it. So there's a common structure of these problems, namely that there's a choice of an action or of an activity. And so here you could go running or you could sleep. And before and after the time for action, there's one set of preferences. So here, go running. But actually at the time of action, there's a temporary preference reversal. And preference reversal is a very decision theoretic way of looking at it. If you're in theory of action, don't take anything thick from the word preferences. You could call it a judgment shift, right? It's not to say that it doesn't have weight. But then actually, I'm going to take a slightly different specific example, mainly because it's one that I've used in the other work, and think about something that I call a stopping problem, but effectively it's a change of preference problem again. So you might think that you want a small amount of some sort of pleasure. So I might want like just one biscuit with my coffee, or I might want to read just one chapter of my novel, or, you know, to surf the internet just for a few minutes. But when the time comes to action, I might actually think, well, I'll have another and another and another. So each time period, you might think, well, just one more, leading to the point where eat the whole pack of biscuits and then afterwards feel sick and regret it. But then the question is, why should you stop? So in decision theory, we often think of these problems of intertemporal choice as though the decision maker is effectively a different person at every point of time. So you have a sort of row of time slices for each time that the person has to make a decision, and think of them as a kind of distinct transient agent. So there are these sort of, as it were, distinct time slices with different sets of preferences, and the transient agent's treated as an independent, rational decision maker. In fact, so even the individual could be an infinity of individuals, and you wouldn't model it that way because most of the time the preferences don't change. But in these particular problems, it's a very interesting way of modeling it because the preferences are changing at different points of time. So now, if we go back to the stopping problem, you can see that my preferences at the start of tea time is to have one biscuit. And I would prefer that to having no biscuits, but I prefer no biscuits to 2 biscuits. But then after I eat the first biscuit, I'm going to have a preference change where I'd rather have 2 biscuits than 1 biscuit, than no biscuit. And the problem is what to do about this. Well, one view is that maybe I could form an intention and just decide to stop at 1 biscuit. But in decision theory, that would be considered to be naive, because basically it doesn't take account of the fact that my time 2 self is a different decision maker with different preferences. Why would they be bound by my intention from time 1? They'll just go and do what they want in time 2. So it gets you in, if you form an intention, it's basically useless and counterproductive. So what can we do in decision theory to solve this problem? Well, we add in a T0 time slice who's got the ability to manipulate the choices, to change the incentives or to change the set of options. So for instance, if I don't want to eat, if I want to change my options so that I don't want to eat a second biscuit at time 2, I could try and change the payoffs. I could make some sort of commitment or bet that I won't eat a second biscuit. So I'd have to pay out to somebody if I did eat. And now in that case, in time 2, I'm not really only getting 2 biscuits. It's 2 biscuits minus some money that I'll lose. And if I make the amount of money large enough, then I can change the preferences around. and now they're in alignment. So ta-da, change the value of the 2 biscuit option, and you probably, certainly on my screen, it's under everybody's faces, but the point is that the 2 biscuit option on time 2 is 2 biscuits less than money, which is what's making it look less attractive. So you solve the incentive problem by changing the value of the options. Another idea about how we could do it, this time we could think about changing the feasible option set. So I can only have a second cookie if there are 2 cookies in the jar. So what can I do? Well, I can go and give them away. So, you know, get rid of it. There we go. And now that's incentive compatible again, because I've just taken that option out of the choice set. And at time 2, I have to stop at 1 because there isn't a second biscuit left to eat. Where are we going? Oh, I don't know why that's, now, actually, these options are there are things you can do that look like self-nudges that roughly fit under this. So for instance, I can put my pack of biscuits inside of a cupboard. Now, you might, well, there's lots of questions about how that might work, but one way of explaining this within standard decision theory, which is probably not the line that anyone in the nudge literature would take, is that what I've actually done is increase the costs. If I stick my biscuits up in a cupboard, so I have to get on a ladder to go and get them, then it is more costly for me to eat a biscuit. Similarly, you might think of something called an implementation intention that you see a bit, certainly in the behavioral science literature. I think it does count as a nudge probably, partly because of how it's supposed to work. So there's this idea that if you make quite a detailed plan, you're more likely to act on it. So the classic example in the literature is making a plan to go and vote. And if somebody phones you up and says, not only will you vote, but they say, when will you do it? What time, you know, what date will you do it on? What time will you do it on? Where will you go and do it? So you get quite a detailed plan. And then that actually makes people more likely to vote. And the kind of, again, the mechanism that it's suggested this operates by is an automatic mechanism in that Peter Goldwitzer, whose theory this is, suggests that once you do that, you sort of commit the plan to memory, you outsource it to the environment. So you have these cues about the time and the place. And when you see the cues, then you automatically do it. So there's this kind of view that it counts as an automatic action. So yeah, it's kind of in this kind of system 1, system 2 literature, that would be potentially a kind of system 1 nudge. And it's kind of interesting that, because in a way, that if you're thinking about the decision maker nudging themselves, so this is being done by like an earlier time slice, nudging itself for later. In a way, there's this kind of lack of agency about it, right? So you're changing the prices or changing the options or sticking something into an automatic process. And that means that the later self then lacks the agency to make the decision because it's been made for them at time 1. Which is kind of interesting, given that you go back and think, well, what was the rationale for nudge? Oh, well, it's supposed to be some sort of libertarian thing. Well, doesn't really look like it. And I suppose this is one of the sort of oblique criticisms of libertarian paternalism is just because, so going back to the cupboard example, just because you don't stick a price on something doesn't mean you haven't changed the costs, right? If it works by changing the costs, why do we care if it's a financial cost rather than a time and effort cost? If it's enough to change my decisions, why is it not coercive? So yeah, looks to me like sort of a lack of agency. And the other thought that people sometimes have, certainly in the philosophy literature, is around intentions and plans. And I said that that this was, well, in a way, this is a slight digression. And so I'm not going to go into it in too much depth, but if people want to ask about it, they can later. But think about why those aren't going to work in the decision theory literature. Well, so firstly, every time slice is kind of an independent decision maker. But then if you look at the philosophy literature, you'll get people like Richard Holton and John Broome, and effectively what they say is that once you've formed an intention, you are not supposed to reconsider it. It's rational not to reconsider. So then the idea would be something like the earlier self forms an intention. And because once there is an intention, there's a rational persistence, then rationally one doesn't need to revise it. So then when my time two selves gets faced with the choice of potentially having a second biscuit, then I just should keep following the resolution without reconsidering it. So you can think of these in a way as sort of rational non-reconsideration accounts. And Richard Holton talks about having a resolution which is specifically formed in order to get over your problem of temptation. But those are kind of puzzling because there's a rational persistence but only whilst you're not thinking about it. If you reopen the question, then it actually is now rational to rethink and come to a new judgment. So John Broome would say something like, your intention should persist until there's a counselling event, but reopening the question is a counselling event. And once you reopen the question, the intention has no rational status. So you start the deliberation again, and again, something they all agree on is something that Michael Bratman calls rational priority of present evaluation. So if I reopen the question at the time I'm being offered the second biscuit, then I can just reevaluate, and then I can eat the second biscuit. And that leaves you with a bunch of problems like, well, so once the rational agent reopens their question, what resources do they have to guard against temptation? And Bratman's like, oh, well, that means we can't do the standard expected utility model. So actually, I think we can do expected utility. We just need to extend it a bit. And in order to do that, I want to think a little bit more about the idea that what we have is a set of time slices who are engaged in an intertemporal strategic interaction. So what you have sort of in economics and decision theory that's very standard is this idea of an externality, this idea that somebody might take an action but not bear all the costs for it because they impact on someone else. So your classic example is pollution. The polluter makes the air bad for everyone, but that's not a cost that they face, so they'll do more pollution than is socially optimal. And you might think with giving into temptation that what you have there is an internality. So this is the word that Daniel Rees coined for it, but effectively an externality amongst selves, because the self at time 2 got to have an extra biscuit, but the other selves felt sick and ate unhealthily and put on weight. So I think there's quite a large parallel between, as it were, interpersonal problems and intrapersonal problems. So effectively, the time 2 self is trying to free ride on all the other selves in the same way that an individual might free ride on other people. And I'm going to use that in order to put together quite quickly a sort of argument about why an individual should resist temptation, kind of drawing on the analogy between the interperson and the intrapersonal case. So in the interpersonal case, as Sophia said, I've worked a lot also on sort of cooperation and collective intentionality. And in the interpersonal case, if we had this sort of externality problem, effectively like an M-person prison's dilemma, what I would say is, well, the problem in decision theory is that it gives all the agency to the individual and not to the group, and that models individuals as asking, what should I do? And that actually it would be much better for the group if the people in the group would think about what was best for the group and what was the best combination of actions for the group and how to perform their part of that combination. And I would say something like, when people group identify, by which I mean not necessarily a psychological idea of group identification, but taking the group as the unit of agency and taking themselves to be a part of that unit of agency, then they can change the question and ask, what should we do and how can I play my part? And I think it probably, although it's slightly divergent from topic, it's easier to think about it, how it works in a group first, because I assume that most people are going to be sort of familiar with prisoners' dilemmas, and then I can say how it would work for an individual. So if you were in this kind of group situation, like a prisoner's dilemma, and you were asking, what should I do? We all know that there is one rational choice in a prisoner's dilemma, namely to defect, because you're always better off defecting than you would be if you cooperated. But if you ask, what should we do? Well, now look at the comparison. Clearly, the defect option is dominated, so that cannot possibly be the answer to what should we do. And then, depending on how you rank these off-diagonal payoffs, it's plausible that you might end up with all cooperate as being the answer. And if you did, someone could ask, how should I play my part? The answer is to cooperate. So now, if we go back and think about our intertemporal problem and think, well, actually, it looks a bit like an intrapersonal prisoner's dilemma. And I actually think, I wonder if I should go backwards. Am I going to be able to go? Maybe it's not going to work. I thought I had a slide that shows this. I've gone too far back. Maybe I don't. Maybe I don't. Well, so the funny thing, well, the reason in a way, one of the reasons that it looks like an intrapersonal prisoner's dilemma is that if you look at these two people and you think that one of the things that the time oneself can do in order to have self-control is not to eat any is to get rid of the biscuits. There are no biscuits. And that you end up in a situation where no one eats any biscuits, but both time 1 and time 2 would have preferred one biscuit. But you can't get there because we know that time 2 has got this temptation to eat a second biscuit. So it's kind of quite similar to this interpersonal problem, prisoner's dilemma, where we know that we'd be better off if we all cooperated, but because there's a kind of sort of individual incentive to defect from it, we all end up worse off. So there's a sense in which there's again an analogy between the interpersonal and the intrapersonal prisoner's dilemma. And again, so we've got the same problems now come up in intrapersonal choice. So we're thinking about this as a set of time slices. And you might think, well, the problem in that is that we're allowing them to think as time slices. We should be making them think as people over time, right? And if they would group identify, and in this situation, we could call it self-identification because they're identifying with the self over time. And they could think of that as the unit of agency and think about what that unit of agency wants to do, what would be the combination of actions by the time slices that would best achieve it, and then what they should do to play their part, maybe that would help. So you might think, you know, when we get to time 2, and the question is, we've eaten one biscuit, and the question is, should I have a second biscuit? The problem is that we're letting them ask, what should I now do? And then the answer to that becomes, eat another biscuit. But if they would identify with the person over time, and they could ask, what should I over time do? And the answer to that would be to stop at one biscuit, you know, to go with the stable preferences. And they can think, how can I play my part? And then the person at time 2 should then decline to have another biscuit. So you can see that this kind of idea from interpersonal choice of team reasoning can be applied to the person over time in order to solve a problem of self-control. And there's going to be sort of 2 complexities to this that we need to think about. One is that not every time slice is going to team reason. So what do I mean by that? Well, sometimes we give in to temptation. But hey, that's not necessarily a problem because you can flex the model and you just think, well, just as you would think about it, if you were doing an interpersonal problem and you're not sure what the preferences and actions of the other agents are, you want to take them as, think of them as being unreliable, then you just think of it as a problem of choice under uncertainty, where there's a probability that they identify and team reason and a probability that they don't. And so then when the time oneself makes a plan, she's thinking of it more as a contingency plan. So if I self-identify at time 2, then I'll follow the plan. But then you might think if the probability that time 2 self-identifies is low enough, then you come up with some other plan, or you don't eat the first biscuit. So that we can do just by thinking, a bit about the uncertainty of self-identification. The other thing is that not every time slice actually needs to reason. So if we go back to our interpersonal problem and we look at this is actually, it's the UK-England women's football team from a few years ago. And all these people are supposed to say, what should we do and how can I play my part? But in fact, they have a coach. She's no longer the coach, but she was then, Hope Powell. And she decides what the plan is, and she can tell them what the plan is, right? And actually, the individuals within the team don't all have to do all the reasoning about what's best. They just have to take the plan from Hope, know that it is a plan that's going to get to the right outcome, and believe that everybody else is going to do their part in the plan. And again, we can do something similar to that in the intrapersonal case. So instead of having a sort of coach who's running the team, what you do have is an earlier time slice, your time oneself, who can form an intention, which, as we've said, is a contingency plan for agents to identify. But the rest of the self doesn't even need to think through the plan, right? If they self-identify, then all they need to do is to remember their part in the plan and carry it out. So we're not even saying that everyone has to reason. They just have to remember the plan, group identify, and do their part. And that roughly gets you a picture of an intention. But that, if you want to read about that, is in other work. What I'm somewhat interested in here, though, this is the bonus material, where we think a little bit about the mechanism and how a mechanism that could apply to a nudge. So having been talking about plans and remembering plans, the easiest way to start about thinking about this is thinking about a reminder and sort of how does a reminder work. So when you write something in your diary, you do it in order to prompt your later self to remember something and then do it. So one mechanism by which having a plan or having an intention can work is the fact that when the time comes to action and you remember it, if you remember that you have a plan or you remember that you have an intention, then that may prompt you to group identify and prompt you to self-identify, and then to follow through on your plan and to resist temptation. But then that mechanism can quite easily apply to some of these sort of nudges. So for instance, the most obvious one is implementation intention. That just is a kind of plan, right? One thing I didn't say earlier, so obviously Goldwitzer thinks it's automatic processes, but you could model this just as well in a classical economic rationality model, or slightly adjusted one. If you think that planning takes time and effort, then having made the plan in advance decreases the cost later on. So it could be a classical economic model. It could be laying it down automatically, like Goldwitzer says. But it could also be the mechanism that I've just suggested, namely that you want to do something that later on you won't necessarily be your time slice preference, but you form a plan, and remembering the plan sort of nudges you or reminds you that you're a self over time and to group identify, and then that can then lead you to carry out the plan. So that's kind of a third mechanism by which these things can work. And I think, I'm not saying it's exclusively the mechanism or that's always how it's worked, but I think it's a possibility. It might also be a possibility in the case of these sort of putting the food in the cupboard scenarios, because, hey, the food is stuck in a high up cupboard. Well, that's not really where we expect it to be. Oh, so why did I put it up there? Oh, yes, because I have a plan, which is, I'm a self over time, my earlier self and my later self all think I shouldn't eat it. So some of these sort of self-nudges, as they were, could be working by a mechanism whereby they sort of cause people to think about their long-term self and their longer-term plans, and therefore to resist temptation when the time comes. So I said I was going to give you a solution to the individual problem that then might help us with a solution to the policymaker problem. But actually, I haven't quite given you a solution to the individual problem yet, right? So the question, well, sort of the question that prompted all of that sort of decision theoretic material in the middle was, what makes it rational not to eat a second biscuit? And I told you that the answer to that is intrapersonal team reasoning. And I told you that identifying with the self over time can lead someone to rationally do intrapersonal team reasoning. But now, why identify with the self over time? So what have I done? Effectively, if you think of thinking again back to the interpersonal problem, the prisoner's dilemma has it's equivalent to saying, well, we've now got two equilibria. So if I identify as a time slice, then the rational thing to do is going to be to eat a second biscuit. But if I identify with the self over time, then the rational thing to do is not to eat a second biscuit. So what's rational depends on my level of identification. So I haven't really told you why an individual should not eat a second biscuit. I've kind of laid out the beginnings of the story about how they can do it. So now I want to think a little bit about why you might do that. So one thought is, oh, well, we're doing, decision theory. So let's think about instrumental rationality. Can we find an answer from within decision theory and instrumental rationality? And so Susan Hurley said, an adequate theory of rational choice should address the question of what the unit of agency amongst those possible should be. So maybe we can use the theory of rational choice to address the unit of agency. But the problem with that, basically, is the instrumental reasoning is about using the means that will achieve your ends. So you can't do instrumental reasoning until you've decided what your ends are. And really, the problem in all these situations is that the different levels of agency or units of agency have got different ends, right? So in the intrapersonal problem, the time slice one has got an end of having a nice biscuit and some sensory payoff, and the ones on either side have got another end around not eating unhealthily or whatever. And so instrumental rationality is not going to help choose between the ends, but if you can't choose between the ends, then you can't get instrumental rationality going. We need a theory of why you should be pursuing one set of ends rather than another. So one view that you see a bit, and now we are going to verge into the nudge literature a bit more, is that somehow we're going to use some sort of consequentialist reasoning in order to do that. So position that Danny Kahneman has, and to be fair, this is it's more nuanced than this, but this is kind of the basic problem with it, is that we could think about, if you think about all the time slices, and each time slice has its own instantaneous utility function, its own utility, its own payoffs, what should we do? We should aggregate the instantaneous utility, and that will give us a measure of intertemporal well-being. And then if you did that, you might think, well, so we can think about doing the action that maximizes intertemporal well-being. And I think people don't say that, but it's often implied. So Nick Chater and George Lowenstein have a piece about why we should do nudge, and they're just like, oh yes, internalities. Those are a reason why policymakers are allowed to nudge. Well, I've kind of got this far through internalities, and I haven't yet given you a reason why we should favor the self over time. And I think implicit in it is this kind of consequentialist, well, it's better for the self over time. What's the problem with that view? Well, back to, we don't actually have a reason to favor the self over time yet. And if you start aggregating, what you're going to end up doing is dissolving the self. You end up pushing yourself towards a full consequentialist agent neutral morality. So when Susan said, yes, the theory of rational choice should help us, she also said, and we should contribute to the best unit of agency possible. And that could also be the group, not the individual. Or you can end up where Derek Parfit ends up, whereby your future self is no different from your friend, so therefore you shouldn't treat them any differently from your friends, and we should all be full-blown utilitarians. So I don't think the consequentialist solution is ever going to get to a situation where it says that individuals should do what's best for them, because you end up in a kind of agent neutral consequentialism. So you're gonna have to think of something else. So here's a couple of ideas about what something else is that comes up in the literature. So here's one from Michael Bratman, and it's the idea that we should have a non-instrumental concern with diachronic self-governance. And that's why we should exert self-control. What actually does it mean to have a non-instrumental end of diachronic self-governance? I admit I'm not 100% sure I understand this, but so one thought, so he starts off with this idea from Harry Frankfurt that we all have a standpoint, which is a web of our relevant attitudes, and it speaks to the agent, and it's supposed to guide her thoughts and actions. Then, so we're going to now get into, he talks about diachronic and synchronic norms of rationality. So the problem with this intertemporal choice is that there seems to be something sort of irrational in terms of making and forming intentions and resolutions over time, whereas synchronic rationality would just be, are your beliefs and preferences and whatever at a time all consistent? And that there's some sort of tension. And so his view is these kind of diachronic norms of rationality about making, keeping plans ought to affect your kind of, your web of beliefs and preferences, et cetera, because he wouldn't limit himself to that at a particular time. And so, but then that means for him that when somebody reopens a question, they've made an intention and they reopen a question, they ought to be able to do some further reasoning in order to exert self-control. So although at time 2, when I want to have another biscuit, my present judgment there conflicts with elements of the standpoint, but including these kind of diachronic things that are going on there. But I've also got this end of self-governance, and that is going to pressure me to ensure some sort of consistency, and it's going to put pressure on my standpoint to change what it is that I want to do at time 2. And he's got a sort of little example about how regret works. So, you know, if I anticipate regret, then that kind of plays a role in my reasoning and tells me I need to shift my standpoint in order to favor sticking with prior plans. Some of the problem with this, or at least the problem with it for what I'm thinking about, which is why should an agent do it, and therefore why should a policymaker do it, is that he then says, well, this non-instrumental end of self-governance, it's not that it's rationally required. It's just that there are good reasons to be a planning agent. So having this kind of non-instrumental end of self-governance is part of what it is to have a kind of stable, rational equilibrium and to be a planning agent who reflects on the structures of their self-government. And that sort of agent will be able to see that. But to be honest, then we're right back into some of the problems in the nudge literature about, well, is this what people really want? Right? What do you say to an agent who doesn't endorse it? It's not rationally required. You ought to see that it's a good thing, but if you don't, well, it doesn't look like he's got anything to say to those people. So it turns it into an empirical question of who has got this non-instrumental end of self-governance, and those people presumably might want to be helped out with it. So I think a slightly more promising route to go is thinking about our need for practical unity over our lifetimes, right? And there's a couple of different ways we could cash this out, and I don't have a strong view on what is the right way, and it may be a hybrid way, but 2 different ways that kind of go with 2 different theorists. So we have Maria Shetman, and she's got a very, what we could think of as an internalist perspective about why we need practical unity. So we need to think that we have interests that extend over time in order to construct our personhood. And what are those interests? There are subjective interests. They're whatever we think are our interests. we need to think that we're doing something important over time and have interests that extend over time, and it matters to us. And you can contrast that with a view like Christine Korsgaard, and she's got what you could think of as an externalist perspective, because she thinks that there are kind of reasons out there that tell you, what is a worthwhile project, and that those practical projects then give you a reason to pursue them. So it's basically very Kantian, and it's the worth of those projects that grounds your unity as a person over time. And that's why you need to drive to unify with your whole selves. And it kind of aligns with sort of more traditional picture of sort of akrasia and temptation, where you think that it's rational to resist temptation because that's somehow the totality of your reasons, right? So your reason's going to push you towards being a practical unity. And I guess one of the problems, I don't know which, it may be that what one wants is a hybrid route, because there's all sorts of problems with Kantian underpinnings, but if you take a really internalist route, then any project will be enough for practical unity, and it might be one that we all think is morally useless. And so we might well want to say more about what sort of projects ground our need for practical unity over our lifetimes, and then it might end up that there's something to be said that's not going as far as being Kantian, but it's a bit stronger than being internalist. But I do think that that's probably the most promising route to why we should self-identify and why we should resist temptation, is about our unity and our agency. And it's quite interesting also psychologically, it ties in with something that William James said about identity. So he thought there's two sort of reasons that you have an identity over time. One of which is kind of proximity. So in a way, it's quite sympathetic to time slice model. So one reason you might feel like you're a self over time is that you're very close to the next self along, and that kind of proximity might make you think that you're the same person. But the other sort of mechanism he's got is this thing called projection. And that's really a unity that comes from the fact that we recognize that all the selves are part of a person. That is actually what makes time slices part of being a person, because we know we're part of a person over time. And so he's got this metaphor with cows, and he says, well, the owner of the herd of cows recognizes his animals because they're branded. But it's not that they're his because they're branded because they're his. So we can recognize amongst the time slices of the self that we're all branded the same, and being branded the same derives from being part of the entity over time. And then James thought that that's the sort of thing that gives you a feeling of mindness and and projection into the future and ownership over your actions. Okay, so sort of enough the decision theory and enough the psychology, and back to thinking about why we should nudge and what can you actually learn about this if you're a policymaker. So I've suggested that as an individual, if you want to resist temptation, then probably the best basis for making the argument about why that is required comes from your sort of agency over the lifetime. And actually, I haven't really gone back to self-nudges, but then that would also be potentially a justification for why you can self-nudge. It's not that you're coercing your future self, it's that you are promoting your agency over the lifetime. So what do we think that says for policymakers? Well, this is where we're getting to two concepts of liberty and Isaiah Berlin. So the first concept of liberty that Berlin identifies is this idea of negative freedom, which is kind of connects very nicely into what people like Thaler and Sunstein are probably thinking when they talk about libertarian paternalism. So the idea of negative freedom is non-interference. And Berlin says, well, his way of putting this is that a person or group of persons is or should be left to do or be what he's able to do or be without interference by other persons. And to be honest, again, oblique criticisms of nudge, this is one reason why libertarian paternalism doesn't really work. If you think that lots of nudges are working through system one, automatic system, are people really being left alone, and are they really free to choose otherwise? I say that's not an original criticism of nudge, but it's, you know, you can see that it doesn't really, what is being done doesn't really fit with the justification for why it's okay to do it. However, Berlin also identifies a second concept of liberty, this positive freedom. Positive freedom, he thinks, is a type of self-mastery, right? So now my life and my decisions should depend on myself and not on external forces of any kind. So now that looks much more like it connects up to what I was saying about why should an individual do it. So an individual does it because it promotes their sense of their agency over time. And similarly, we've got this idea of positive freedom, where what we should be promoting is self-mastery. And you might think these two things are connected up by the agency and the self-mastery, by both being connected to autonomy. And I did say I was going to talk about Republican freedom, and I'm not going to, because I think it's too tricky and will take too long, but we could talk about how that tries to put these things together later. I suppose what I sort of want to end on is the idea that actually, I basically think libertarian paternalism is the wrong concept of liberty. It won't get what is needed out of it. And that if you want, as a policymaker, to be justifying why you're doing a nudge, you have to leave it and go towards positive freedom. Maybe what you end up is at Republican freedom, but maybe not. As I said, it's complicated. And think about it in terms of helping people achieve self-mastery in order to achieve their autonomy. Okay, so to conclude, I kind of dragged you through quite a lot of stuff on, I was thinking about intertemporal nudges and the justification of nudge in terms of libertarian paternalism. And I dragged you through quite a lot of material on individual decision makers and how they can justify delaying gratification, also justify nudging themselves to do something. And I think the justification for individuals to delay gratification in their intertemporal problems comes from their need to pursue their to promote and pursue their intertemporal interests and their agency over time. Then we can move along and think of that as a justification for policymakers, and it connects to positive and possibly to Republican views of freedom. But yeah, negative freedom is not going to cut the mustard. Thanks. I should say the stuff in the middle was funded by an ERC grant, not the nudge stuff, but so thank them for funding the person over time material.
Thank you, Natalie. That was great. Thank you very much. So I think we are ready for questions. If you can raise your hand, I will unmute you. Okay, so Chiara. Ciao, Chiara.
Oh. Thanks very much. So I wanted to ask a bit more about why you thought that there's a problem in terms of agency of the individual when an individual sets up nudges for themselves. And in the moment in which they're following their nudge, whatever that is, you said, I think it's a bit problematic because it doesn't seem to me that the individual has agency at that point. But I thought that this doesn't seem to be that much of a problem insofar as it's the individual that set up things that way for themselves and potentially in a condition when they were well informed and so on. So yeah, I just wanted to, ask a bit more about what's problematic.
So I guess I think that that's already assumed the answer to the problem. So you said it's not problematic. Well, this depends. There's two different things you said. It's not problematic because the individual did it. Well, now you've already assumed that either the individual as a whole or the earlier time slice of the individual gets preference. So then I'm going to go back and say to you why. Now, you did say one other thing in there that would potentially count as justification around being better informed. And certainly you might think in some of these situations that somebody is, at the time of temptation, you're either emotional or your sort of rational faculties are being overridden. And then I guess if you start running that line, then that will give you another reason for privileging other parts of the self. I guess I've been more neutral about that. Why? Well, so one reason is I think we'd all have a very dull life if we never ever gave in to temptations. But so I'm not sure I would, we never followed our emotions. I guess I don't really love the distinction between sort of rationality and emotions. But you do end up kind of on the same track, because you kind of end up on a self-mastery track, that there are these bits of the self that are not fulfilling the long-term interests, and therefore we shouldn't promote them. But then you're ending up with a different reason why, and you're taking it out of the circumstances of decision-making. Yeah, and then we have to have some sort of reason about, why we don't like the emotional bit of the decision-making. And, nowadays there's quite a lot of evidence that actually following your emotion and your intuitions can sometimes get you in a better place than thinking about stuff. So I guess I'm not rushing down that route, though I can see where how you might start making an argument from that perspective.
Thanks, that helps.
Okay, next is Jurgis. Sorry, I just forgot to mention that we are recording the Q&A as well, but if anyone does not want their questions to be included in the video, just let me know in the chat and I will cut the part. So Jurgis.
Thanks. Thanks, Natalie. This was great. I wanted to ask, so I have actually many questions, but here's one. So at some part we were talking about these, that there can be different ends, right? Individual can have ends, and the group agent can have ends, and these ends are not the same, and might conflict. So here's like a proposal I wanted to run by you and see what you think about it. Maybe because part of what you are trying to address, is there a theory which could say that one of these ends should take the upper hand? But why not leave it at the level that this is a question about the choice of ends, and there are conflicting ends, and you have to choose between them. So, and you might have some reasons to go for like individualistic ends. You might have some reasons to go for collective ends. Of course, nudge then is seen in a completely different way, because nudge is shaping what ends you pursue, not nudging you in the direction of the ends which you already have, sort of, right? So that's kind of the idea here, and see what you think about it.
Yeah, I'm always wondering something stronger, because you're talking about individuals who potentially could weigh up their reasons. But I mean, you could almost, so another way of running it would be to think like, objectively, a bit like, theories about what makes life go well, and a sort of objective list theory, that we should be able to specify a list of what counts as a good end. And then we just kind of look at people's ends and ends of the individual versus the group, or the time slice versus self, and we just see which one counts as a good end according to the criteria on our list. And then they ought to pursue that one. And again, I can see how you could run that line. I think you're going to get into a lot of trouble in how you draw up that list. And there are lots of problems with objective list theories about how you can deal with things like cultural relativity. And then your policymaker, though, is doing straight paternalism, right? And again, which is what Thaler and Stuntz, trying to deny that they're doing, right? We think it's better for you to be healthy than to eat cake, so we will restructure the environment so that you are healthy and eat cake. But they are trying to do that without saying that's what they're doing. So yeah, and yeah, you could do that. Again, another way of doing it, and yes, it would be agent neutral. So I think if you could do that, then it could work.
Thanks.
Sophia, no, Eddie, you were muted, but yes, you.
Okay.
Yes. Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you. I like the talk very much. Very, very instructive and clear. So you presented at the beginning a distinction between nudging concerning choices that people do that are wrong from the point of view of the group, society, or super individual. And so you didn't discuss this much. And then you discussed the case in which substantially people, I think there are some subtleties there, but more or less was cases of weakness of the will, when people go against their best judgment. That's very interesting. So some people will say, oh, how you judge what the best judgment is, blah, blah, blah. But that's more or less the thing. I think there is a third class of cases. Let me give you an example. So there is a little town in the Midwest in America that has the highest rate of people who, although the lowest life expectancy, because people eat junk food all the time. So they die for heart attack, stroke, all these things. So a famous chef went there and opened a little school for children where he taught them to eat better. Just kind of a nudging. He wasn't forcing anything, just taught them to eat better. After a few months, the parents of the children had the school closed because they say, oh, that's our society, this is our identity, we want to eat junk food, it's our freedom, the libertarian stuff. So it's an interesting case because in this case, people are doing something that is bad for them, and nudging would be useful for them, not just for society, also for society, but for them, but it doesn't go against their best judgment, because their best judgment doesn't exist at all in this case. So it's an interesting case, I think, for your model. Thank you.
Yeah, and so why do you think can I ask, why do you think their best judgment doesn't exist? Or
no, because people refuse, best judgment in some kind of objective way, right? So the parents say, we don't care about good food. Even if we don't care, that's our identity. I think we can objectively say that is not best judgment, that they die at 50 because they eat, fries all day, every day. So yeah, if one is a really individualistic, relativistic about objectivity or something, can say that their best judgment is to eat junk food, but because they die so early, we can say they are wrong.
Okay, so now you're back into the sort of argument that Jurgis was making, that we can somehow judge people's ends from the outside and decide which ones of them are worth pursuing and which ones aren't. And then the justification for doing it becomes they're not pursuing worthwhile ends. So yeah, so that's one sort of thing you could do. And exactly that sort of case is really a problem for Thaler and Sunstein, because if they really think that nudge is about non-interference, it's all this kind of, oh, well, people are better off as judged by themselves. But what if they don't actually agree? They're not really better off as judged by themselves. They're better off as being judged by the policymaker. And so if you really are running a Thaler and Sunstein line that says better off as judged by themselves, and they say no thanks, then you ought to go home and you shouldn't be doing it. And again, you kind of end up in this empirical discussion about what do people actually want, because that's your justification for policy making, and whether that's actually consistent with what they want policy to do is another question. So yes, I think it is potentially problematic. I suppose you might worry as well if it's going to end up being problematic for the sort of line I was running, because on the one hand, so this is kind of why I avoided talking about Republicanism. I think you end up in a case where there's quite a lot of trade-offs, because what actually is better for someone's autonomy? So we can sort of nudge them to eat better and they'll have a longer life and they'll get more stuff done. But we also know that they don't want to, that they've made kind of, as it were, an informed choice not to do that. So which of those two things actually supports their self-mastery? And I think those sort of tensions, the reason I didn't talk about Republicanism is because I think it gets even worse there, because you think about non-domination, which is both non-interference, but it's also about having resources, so it can come down anywhere on the political spectrum, depending on how you trade those things off. But probably we can't actually avoid getting into those discussions, and we have to decide how we weigh that up. Which of those supports self-mastery and why, or which of those supports non-denomination and why?
Thank you.
Benedetta? Yes.
So thank you very much for your very interesting presentation. And I have, two very quick questions. The first one regards the issue of adaptive preferences. So if you think that nudge would also be helpful to, contrast adaptive preferences by letting people engage in a more sort of rational deliberation about what their ends are over time, or whether you think that they would not resist, adaptive preferences. And the second question regards your understanding of freedom. Especially at the end of the talk, you mentioned the importance of positive freedom, if I got it right, and related it to self-mastery and autonomy. And I was thinking at that point, what do you think about attempts to deliberately restrict our freedom so as to behave rationally? Like, for example, the famous cases discussed by Elster with regard to both individual rationality and also with regard to different kinds of us binding together through constitutions, for example, so as to refrain from having some options in order to be more free in a certain sense. Thank you.
Okay, so that's two quite different things. So adaptive preferences, I very much, in the model, it was about preferences that revert. So I guess what you're talking about is a very important but slightly different situation where preferences might change over time. It did remind me a little bit of Mario's example, in that it's quite this sort of this idea that if you try stuff and it's better for you, then you somehow ought to like it, and the best ideas in the marketplace will all win out. And I suppose my immediate thought of that is, but that is just not what people doing nudge think they're doing. We're working via heuristics and biases, we're working via automatic processes. We're not like giving you the chance to try something in the hope that you'll then see that it's better. So I don't know so there's two questions. One is like, what would I make of that? And I think the quick answer is I haven't really thought about it, because it's not the framework I've been thinking of, but I do think it's important. And the second question is, how does it feed into this kind of justification for nudge? And I think it doesn't, because it's rational and reflective. And on the whole, most of the nudge stuff is about not being rational and not being reflective. So in terms of constraining yourself and freedom, I think definitely you could sometimes need to bind yourself in order to promote your freedom. And this is partly, so if you think about, that's partly just comes from a sort of broader opinion I have, that there's no point having choices if there's nothing worthwhile to choose. So it's much better just to have one thing that you would like than to be offered an entire menu of things that you wouldn't want and that wouldn't be good for you. Or similarly with negative and positive freedom, if you sort of stick me in an empty room and I can do whatever I want and I'm not impeded, that's probably not going to be that interesting. And I might much rather be bound to do something that's actually worthwhile that I would want to do. So that I'm in general sympathetic to that. And then I think I would sort of go one further. And again, this is going to take you back into the Republican stuff that I didn't talk about. But again, that's partly about how the relationship between the individual and the system, and how you need to structure the system right in order for the individuals within it to be free. And it may well be that you want to bind yourself into a good system in order to, increase your opportunities to do things. And then I suppose it's back to, that sort of thing. When I started off at the beginning, I said, all the self nudges, they look like the agent at time one is trying to take away from the choice at time two. So that's kind of a form of self-binding, but it's a self-binding that's justified because it promotes your agency and your autonomy over time, even though there's the sense in which you did restrict it for that single time slice. So yes, I would approve of self-binding.
Arianna?
Hi, thanks a lot for the talk. It was really interesting. So I had two questions. One related to your team players analogy, which I thought I was wondering whether you agree that it could lend itself well to mathematical modeling, whereby you're saying maybe one or two of the team players are defectors or they're lazy, but the overall team, so you could kind of justify it based on the democratic majority saying, well, no, we want to focus on the long-term goal, and whether that's already been done. And then my second question was with respect to the effects of economic precarity on an individual's ability to see their long-term interest or to see themselves as part of a unified whole. I'm just thinking of the kinds of businesses that exploit what seem to be cognitive biases in favor of short-term gratification when there doesn't seem to be any point in investing in deferred gratification because there's no hope of building that kind of stability anyway.
Okay, so the first question about mathematical modeling slightly depends what you're thinking about modeling. So the idea that you could run a model whereby there's a group of people and they're not sure if other people will identify and it's probabilistic. So the first place to go to see that would probably be Michael Bacharach's book, Beyond Individual Choice. I do actually think there's still loads more that could be done in that sort of field. And certainly all the examples are of one individual and one group, and you might think there is one individual and multiple groups, or there might be a time slice and an individual and a group, and that those things need to be thought about. But you also slightly gestured at what I would think of as being more a problem of judgment aggregation. So we should do it because the majority of people want it. And certainly everything that I presented, it's been slightly a black box about how you get to what the group ends are. And I definitely don't think it necessarily is going to be some aggregation of individuals. And we all know that there's lots of problems of aggregating individual judgments, like you'll very quickly get into, Arrow. But again, I think there's not a lot out there on how you ought to move from time slice to individual. There's obviously more on how you move from individuals to groups. Yeah, so the other question about economic precariousness. So, gosh, I mean, there's lots and lots of interesting things there. So one sort of thought that you see in that literature is that if you're in a sort of economically precarious situation, you just don't have cognitive space for anything. And certainly the sort of solutions that I was suggesting about, identify with self and think of yourself as a team over time. Now, if potentially there's any sort of effort or cognitive effort involved in that, then you might think that becomes more difficult if things are more precarious. I think it's certainly true that people are more likely to give into temptation when they're tired, which does suggest to me that all this is a bit effortful. And so being in a precarious situation could definitely definitely be sort of unhelpful. Yeah, I'm not quite sure. I mean, it was quite, I don't know if I've answered it. I mean, have I answered what you were asking about precarity or, yeah, okay. And I do think that makes those people easier to exploit in the same way you can exploit heuristic and bias. If you've got a type of person who is, I mean, that's one of the reasons why economists think this stuff is irrational. This kind of hyperbolic discounting is irrational because effectively you can get a preference reversal and you can get people to pay, for an entirely predictable, you can extract money and rent out of them for doing that. So definitely it's an exploitable sort of situation to be in.
Nora?
Thank you. Sorry, I got the times a bit mixed up, so I don't know if you've talked about this, but one question I've been wondering about for a while about nudging. So often nudges are sort of taken to operate on the societal level, right? So we place food in the cafeteria in a certain way or something, so we try to nudge a group of people. And one problem with this is that it's not sensitive to individual needs. So you might have your anorexic who needs to eat more, and then you have an overweight person who wants to eat less. And if you have a nudge that forces everyone to eat, say, less calorie dense foods, then that's not so good for the anorexic, perhaps. So one strategy you could pursue is that you try and make the nudges very sensitive to individual needs. And now the question is, then your nudge ends up to be just about the individual. But if you have a view as you propose, so thinking of an agent as a series of time slices, I was wondering whether you might get the very same problem again, or how you would go about this. I hope this makes sense.
Yeah, so definitely the idea that nudges are at the population level, yes, and that's going to be a problem with any public policy, right? Because most policies, there's a single tax policy for everyone. That's how things operate. So then you do end up in a situation where you can't suit everyone, and you try and set things up by some metric, just do what's best overall, or to help the populations that are worse off. But for an individual, so how is that going to work? I'm just thinking what the analogy is. So you might think, if I put the biscuits in the cupboard, then the biscuit's always going to be in the cupboard for every single one of my time slices. And maybe sometimes I would actually be better off eating the biscuit. I mean, so one thing you could, and now a lot of it's going to depend on how you think it works. So, I mean, if you think it works by increasing the costs of getting the biscuit, then maybe if my desire for a biscuit is super strong, then I will overcome the costs. So you might think the reason for putting it up there is that when I have a kind of sort of minimal urge that I should not do it. And similarly, that sort of reasoning could carry over to the sort of self-identification argument, that obviously you're thinking about, why did I put the biscuits up there? Oh, I did it because I should have a long-term plan not to eat a biscuit. But then you might think something like, but actually in this case, it's not a bad situation to be eating a biscuit in. So it's okay to do it. So I think where it really becomes a problem is if you think the nudge is working by automatic processes, because then it's going to have to affect you all the time. What all the time slices all the time. So yeah, I think the answer is definitely process dependent. Although I think the other wrinkle is the idea that you could sort of reason about it and think about, well, I'd quite like a biscuit, and actually it probably is justified in terms of the overall plan, because this is one of those situations where it's okay to have a biscuit. You're opening the door to a lot of self-deception there, and it might be all very well and good in rational agent land to do that reasoning, but for real people, it might not work so well. But yeah, I think the automatic nudges is going to be a problem anywhere. But if the mechanism, then you might flip the question back and say, if the mechanism of nudge is not system one processes, but it's some sort of cost increase, or it's some sort of identification with what you want overall, then it won't necessarily work on everyone. But then I'm not sure at a population level, that's a good question. So things like the cafeteria example do look like they are more automatic. Well, they can, if the fruit comes first, that could remind you that you want fruit over time. I mean, you could, I guess it's arguable either way. So we need to know more about mechanism in that case, I think.
Okay, I would have a question myself, if I may. So I'd like to go back to your analogy between the externality and internality situation, and in particular to your example of the person who pollutes but does not bear any cost of that, or not the major cost. And I like the way in which you highlighted the analogy between the internal case and the external case. But this seems to me a potential disanalogy between the two situations, because of course, in the case of the intrapersonal case, I'm also the one who will have the cost, or face the cost of in the future, which seems a bit different in the external case or interpersonal situation. So I was just wondering how this anticipated regret or this extra cost that we have in the intrapersonal case enters the model and which role it plays.
So the first thing I would do is maybe challenge the question. So if you're in a time slice model, the time slice doesn't exist in the next moment, right? So you might think actually we're a series of instantaneous people that disappear, and maybe we're the sum and collection of our memories. So, you know, and if I don't care about my future self, and I think about the sort of me now bit that's not going to be around in the future, then why would I care? Why would I think, oh, the consequences are happening to me? Well, it's not me. It's not going to be me, maybe, is what I would think. And I suppose you might think that's a bit of sort of fragmented and odd sort of reasoning. And then I guess I'd say, well, yeah, that's going towards having a sense of agency that's not really quite right, and that it would be better not to have that. But then again, I think that's a normative. That's a normative.
Sorry, I guess my question was more from a psychological point of view. That's not really how people reason about themselves. Not they have a sort of identity over time. They reason about themselves in the future or things like that. So that's why I would say that there is an asymmetry between the polluter case and the agent case or the intrapersonal case.
Well, but they reason about themselves in the future when they're thinking about themselves as a person over time. I mean, they also reason about their families and what's good and bad for their family when they're in a mode of thinking that that's the important thing. So I guess I'm less certain that the analogy breaks down, because I think, I mean, you could argue about how strong it is and in what cases, but I think that there are cases in groups where people reason about the group. And I think there are cases in the time slice where people are not interested in the self over time. So, yeah. So I think maybe I'm going to dispute the idea that there's a strong difference there between the interpersonal and the intrapersonal case. I mean, having said that, you know, there are situations where we're more and less likely to do it. So again, I suppose I could imagine where you could come at it with an argument that people are more likely to unify with themselves over time than they are to unify with a group. And that probably makes quite a lot of sense for lots of reasons. I said, yeah, I don't think there are structural differences, though.
Thank you. Okay, I don't see any other questions. So if you have a question, that's the right time to raise your hand. Otherwise, I don't know, Natalie, if you want to add something, or Chiara has another question. So Chiara?
Thank you. I was just saying, you need to unmute me. It's more of a clarificatory question to see whether I've got the framework right. So the extent to which nudges can be said to be at all libertarian, if I understood correctly, depends on two things at least. One, which kind of mechanism is exploited in order to implement the nudge, and also getting the agent right. Like, is it the case that if you manage to answer the question of which agent time slice should be, and their preferences should be privileged, as long as the nudge is implementing their preferences, then insofar as this is happening, then they are libertarian, or does that not matter?
So I don't think that libertarian paternalism works. I think it doesn't make any difference what the mechanism is. I suppose if they thought the mechanism was something to do with system 2, then you could start to get a justification for libertarian paternalism. But that's not the route that anybody is taking. And the minute you think it's an automatic motivation, it's really hard to see why these nudges are at all libertarian. There was another bit, and I forgot to repeat what the second bit was.
Yes, the other bit was granting what you just said, assuming that we managed to get an answer to the question as to which agent slice should be preferred and should be identified as, you know, the agent as a whole. Assuming we can answer that question, supposing that the nudges implement their preferences, have we made any headway on whether, you know, nudges are at all libertarian, or whether we're free when we follow a nudge?
Yeah, I kind of think that's orthogonal. I mean, Thaler and Sunstein every so often say, okay, because it's what people want as it's what they would prefer. But that's not what libertarianism is about. Libertarian freedom is about non-interference. It's not about what you want. So that just, to me, seems to be a completely different line of argument. And yes, it's another line that they say. But then that sounds, in some senses, very authoritarian. It's okay for us to nudge you because we know what you really want. So, you know, I don't think that's a very appealing line to take either. And I think it's not at all clear whether it is what people really want. And it, you know, for the same sort of reasons that Mario was talking about, you can change the cafeteria. And there's lots of people who say they want to eat unhealthily. It reminds me of something similar in the UK, this chef Jamie Oliver, and there's a whole TV program where he tries to make the school cafeteria better. And the parents, but the mothers, of course, come at lunchtime with chips and give them to their kids through the railings, right? And are we really? We're not. We're imposing a middle-class idea of what a good life is on other people. And then the question is that acceptable and why? And I think it's very self-deceptive to say that you're doing it because it improves their freedom or it's what they really want. Those two lines are just not going to get you anywhere. And then, as Mario pointed out, the whole self-mastery line is still going to be a bit tricky, because if it's what they really want, there is a part of autonomy and a part of freedom that is about being allowed to make your own choices. And even if that's something that's not necessarily in some ways good for you, so there's definitely going to be a kind of trade-off around like the things that we think people objectively need in order to pursue their agency and live a good life, and giving them a space to make bad choices as well, to make choices that won't lead them to a good life. Because if they don't have the space to make the choices, then there's a sense in which they're not autonomous either. So it's kind of about finding that balance. And I don't think there's necessarily a good theory of what the balance is. And again, if you come back to that Republican stuff that I said I wasn't going to talk about non-domination, this is exactly the sort of balance that Philip Pettit is, well, he's not even trying to find, because there's this claim that you can believe my theory, whatever political stripe you are, because some people will balance it off towards the non-interference side, and other people will balance it off towards the sort of economic support side. So it's kind of in the space that I've now sat in, where there's a trade-off and we haven't got a theory of how, and different people are going to say that the trade-off should be made in a different place. But yeah, and I think people could take Philip's framework, and people of all stripes could agree with the framework, but then the implementation of it is going to depend on how you make those trade-offs. So it's not really enough to say we agree. Well, if you say we agree on the framework, then you can say we have agreed on the terms of debate, but that is certainly not going to solve the debate. Yeah, and I think it's just wrong of Thaler and Sunstein to say we can put the entire debate in terms of non-interference and negative liberty, and that gets all the answers. But then I don't think negative freedom is really worth having. So, yeah.
Hi, yeah, thanks for the talk. I just wanted to ask, going a little bit into nudge theory, what's your take on something that nudge proponents like to fall back on, which is the inevitability argument, the idea that you need to arrange the cafeteria in some way, and then when you arrange it, you might as well fall back either on an objective idea of health or some idea of aggregation about how people might want to choose their food in an econ conception. So what would be your take? How would you take that?
That sounds like a perfectly sensible argument to me. I mean, if you do nothing, you don't end up in a neutral space, because we all know that every supermarket and every online company are doing A/B testing, and they're setting up the environment to achieve their ends. But then the problem with that is it doesn't help Thaler and Sunstein, because effectively the argument there is something like saying, well, the state should protect the individual from these other organizations that are preying on the individual. And I think that is a perfectly coherent line. Or if you're going the objective route, the state should have an idea of what is the objectively better outcome, and then it should implement it and step in to counterbalance negative forces. Well, that's great, but none of that is libertarian paternalism. I mean, I can buy into all of that because it all fits quite nicely with the kind of self-mastery and autonomy picture, or a consequentialist one. If you want to be consequentialist, that's also a great picture, but they're not being consequentialist and they're not doing self-mastery, so it doesn't get them anywhere.
So you're saying that it doesn't benefit them as far as they're trying to be libertarian paternalists, but it's not that bad in terms of a normative case.
Right, exactly. You could make a normative case, but it's not their normative case.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah. And it's almost like saying, well, libertarian paternalism is wrong, because the whole point about libertarian paternalism, well, I suppose, so someone said earlier, what about the good as judged by themselves argument? And I suppose that's them trying to escape paternalism. So I spent sort of the talk talking about how they're trying to be libertarian and escape this kind of idea that the state is doing something to you. But they're also slightly trying to escape paternalism by saying, well, it's not really paternalism because it's what you'd want anyway. And again, I don't think that necessarily really works. And I think that what you've done is, so I've been attacking the libertarian side of the argument. You've slightly attacked that it's not really paternalism side of the argument by saying, well, yes, it is, because it's about the state stepping in to protect us from predators. And yeah, I think it's paternalism as well. So I'm quite, and I'm not sure that I think paternalism is always a bad thing. I don't know, maybe I don't have a considered view about it, but I think they're very strongly, I've always thought, I mean, they're coming, so I guess this is probably a room mainly of Europeans, well, right? And so from countries where, you know, having a paternalist welfare state is the default, and it's sort of what people expect. And I've always slightly thought, well, Thaler and Sunstein are writing for an American audience where it's all about the right to do what you want. And so what they're trying to do is effectively justify the sort of social things that we all take for granted, but without buying in any of the premises about paternalism or providing economic support that actually underpin our welfare states. And I guess I just don't think it works. And the answer is that way of thinking about the state and about how people should live their lives is just not a very good one. They would be, but there's some political reason to need to make it if you want to effectively do something paternalist in a culture that does not support paternalism as part of the goal of public policy.
Well, if I just may, a short follow-up on that. That's why I always took that the label of libertarian paternalism was more of a publicity thing for Thaler and Sunstein than actually a very serious philosophical way to claim a normative case.
Well, certainly Sunstein's written a lot about it, so you would think that means he does buy into it. So I think the more I see of them, the more I think they possibly do really believe it. But I think when I first saw it, I thought, how could anyone believe that? It must be being written for the purposes of convincing other people rather than being convinced themselves.
Thanks.
Okay, there is any other question? If not, I really would like to thank Natalie for this wonderful talk and for being so generous also with the questions. Thank you, Natalie. And I don't know if Mario or Benedetta want to say something. Otherwise, I want to mention that the next meeting will be on the 5th of June, and we will have Fiorella Battaglia, which I believe is also one of our attendants, and she will talk about predictive algorithms and epistemic injustice. So thank you again, Natalie, and hope to see you in person very soon.
Yes, preferably in Rome.
Possibly in Rome, yes, you'll be invited at some point.
Yeah, I think that's the last time I went to Rome was when I saw you at that talk.
Okay.
Oh, wow.
Okay, thank you everybody for being here, and have a nice evening. Sorry, Fiorella will be on the 17th of June. Sorry, my mistake. Okay. Bye-bye. Thank you.